Oh, great. I did hear someone just then.
I think that was, yeah, your handy Zoom assistant.
Yeah. Oh, was it? Did it say testing? Yeah. Great. Well, it is a little past 3:30, and so I do want to start. Um, and so everyone submitted their questions to me, Rowan, and I thought I would start with some questions, and then if students have more questions with your answers, we'll just see how it goes and flows, and we'll
Okay.
go from there. I want to say I have 19. You can't see, but I have 19 students on the call, and that's a little less than half the class. But like I said, there's so much chaos right now. Who knows what's going on
Yeah.
in people's lives? Because they also all of their classes got transitioned to online. So
Right.
so I'm not sure. Luckily, we already are online. So I'm going to start with one question based on what they read in your book, and I thought it was kind of a fun question to start with. It's light, so we'll work into the harder questions. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So one of your central claims throughout the book is that oysters exhibit a level of terroir or mirar that is unique among shellfish and seafood due to direct filter feeding from their local environs. Are there any shellfish or larger fish that exhibit a less pronounced but noticeable variation in this concept?
Yeah, I would actually say that all shellfish are gonna terroir is going to be an important factor for all of them, and obviously they're all going to take on flavors of their environment for the same reasons that oysters do. Um, what I think, as I've thought about this over the years, what I think sets oysters apart actually is just that they are so delicate compared to a lot of other types of shellfish. Um, and also that you eat the whole oyster, where something like a scallop, most people are just eating the muscle. But like something like a clam, I think no question, the water, the terroir is going to make a big difference, or is going to be a factor. But a clam has such a pronounced flavor already that it's going to kind of drown out the more subtle environment notes. Where an oyster, the flavor is kind of pulled back enough that those environmental qualities really are pronounced. They come to the fore. The same way, like, if you have a spicy sauce, you can't tell much what's happening underneath that big hit of spice.
Does anyone have a follow-up question or no? Because I'll keep moving on because we've got plenty of questions. And I just wanted to wait till more people are on, Rowan, so that I didn't have you introduce yourself and tell your background more than once. And so we've got 21 people now, and maybe after this next question, you can tell people a little bit about yourself. But so the next question, kind of in the same theme, is that through the reading, I learned that seasons have a big impact on flavor of the oyster. And the flavor is different at different seasons. And does that mean that there's 4 flavors for one kind of oyster throughout the year? Or is it just one flavor like consistently throughout the year? I thought it was kind of an interesting question. And of course, there's a little bit more kind of fact and science that goes into that answer, right?
For sure, yeah. And I mean, I would argue that there's more than 4 seasons. Like, we think of there being 4 seasons, but certainly in New England, there's more than 4. Like here in Vermont, right now we're in the thick of mud season. So I don't know. There's probably like 20 different seasons. Yeah, the flavor basically is going to change throughout the year. Is that a question or just background?
That's someone in the background. I don't really want to mute everyone because then I can't, and people can't ask questions. So if it becomes
Right.
a problem, I will. But at this moment,
Okay.
I don't have to.
Well, anyway, the flavor is just, it's going to change throughout the year, partly because of what's in the water with the oyster, and partly because of what the oyster's doing. So in summer, if it's spawning, it's going to have a particular type of flavor because it's going to have a lot of gonad in it. And then in the fall, it's going to be fattening up its body with amino acids and sugars, so it's going to have a rich, full flavor in the fall. And then in the spring, it's going to be skinnier because it's been living all winter off of its reserves. but then that's going to be different for different parts of the country, depending on like different oysters in different environments have different seasonal cycles. Like down in the Gulf of Mexico, the water's so warm that the oysters never shut down and go into hibernation like they do in New England. So there it's going to be different. But then also there's really, there can be some really interesting seasonal variations. And the one I know of that's the most interesting that's been studied is in the Pacific Northwest. You know, they can look at the isotopes in an oyster and learn whether those isotopes came from a marine environment or a land environment. And what they find in some of the Pacific Northwest oysters, like in Hood Canal, which is right on the edge of the Olympic Peninsula, is that in the spring, the isotopes in the oysters are actually mostly land-based, meaning that what the oysters are eating is not marine algae, but it's stuff from the land. And that's because in the spring, as the snow melts, the rivers in the Olympic Peninsula are flushing all. Can you hear me?
That was me having to. Can
Okay.
whoever is talking mute themselves, please?
Anyway, so so in the spring, in that environment, the oysters are mostly feeding off of leaf detritus that had fallen on land and washed down the rivers. So they're much more terrestrial than we tend to think of them as. So anyway, yeah, that's a long answer to the short question that
Well,
they're
actually,
constantly changing because of the seasons.
that wasn't as short a question because there was another piece of it, and it said, "Are there any shellfish or larger fish?" No, sorry. Is it possible to keep an oyster or a kind of oyster to have the most consistent and popular flavor to get the most benefit?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, of course, as with all other food sources, generally what people want is consistency. Like we're used to having pretty like consistent, regular, predictable flavors in our foods, and it can be tough if there's a lot of variation. Like most consumers aren't used to that, and even most like retail establishments aren't used to dealing with that. But the big exception, of course, is the wine world. The wine industry trained us really well to expect seasonal variation and actually to think of that as like a positive thing. So part of the reason I sort of always used the wine world as my model for what was happening in the oyster world was that the rules are different in wine, and oysters seem to be like the first food that came along that was playing by the wine rules rather than the regular food rules. So you can't, if you want consistency, like there's an oyster called the cushy, which some people are probably familiar with. Super consistent. It's grown in British Columbia, in deep waters where there's probably less variation in the environment throughout the year. But then the oysters are also tumbled incessantly to make them into a very uniform product. Some people think that's great. Some people think they're a little too, soulless compared to oysters that are less uniform.
So there's some questions on the side that you can't see, I don't think, but I can. But why don't we take a second and you could tell people a little bit about yourself, what brought you to write a couple books on oysters and kind of the books that you've written since then, because Rowan writes a lot. I find you rather prolific articles and books, but also prolific in his subject matter. So I just think that would be interesting for a second to do that, and then we'll go back to more questions.
Sure. I'm kind of like what I was starting to talk about. I got interested in oysters. I'd always been interested in wine, and for me, part of the charm of wine was the terroir, that wines were different in every place, and partly it depended on the place. So wine was always a great and sort of romantic way to explore a place through taste. And then I started to I started to think, well, what's so special about grapes? That's probably true for lots of foods. And oysters were the first one that came along where it was really obvious. And the obvious part, which if people have read my book, they know I talk about in there too, is that oysters were the only food I knew of that, like wine, were traditionally named for the place they came from. So an Apalachicola or a Wellfleet, it was because people hundreds of years ago had recognized that the place mattered, and the oysters from that bay had something distinctive about them. And of course, nobody had written about oysters in that way yet. So the territory was open, which is always important when you're a book writer, to not do what a bunch of people have already done. So it was just my own personal fascination, and I wanted a guide so that when I walked into an oyster bar and sat down and looked at that list of 12 names that meant nothing to me, I had something to go to, and it didn't exist. So I decided to do it for myself and for whoever else might be interested.
And the books that you've written since then have included topics about apples and a few other things, right? And so what else? You also wrote a second book to this, Geography of Oysters, right?
I eventually, just a couple of years ago, wrote a follow-up oyster book called The Essential Oyster, which just sort of like, it was like 10 years later, so, and a lot had changed in the oyster world. That first book, Geography of Oysters, just happened to catch the wave of oyster obsession in America perfectly, which was great for the book, but it also meant that things change fast. So 10 years later, I wanted to sort of do a book that would cover the current scene, and use a lot more photos for people that were looking for that kind of approach. But yeah, in terms of my subject matter, I tend to go back and forth between like apocalyptic, oh my God, the world is ending, gloomy environmental books, and then happy food books. And you know, I do a gloomy environmental book, and then all I want to do is write a book about some happy food topic to make myself feel better, and to like shine a light on something that's good in the world. And then I go back to the doom and gloom.
So I just want to read some of the comments on the side of the page, on the chat, just so you know, and you can respond to them if you'd like. Well, one person just said, hi, Rowan, thank you so much for joining us. It makes sense that other flavors will dominate the terroir signatures, which responded to your first comment. And I don't know if you want to respond to that at all. And then someone else asked, of course, this is completely subjective, but what is the most flavorful or flavorable oyster, and where is it from? And I know it's completely a personal choice, so maybe you should tell us what your favorite oyster is. And I just want to say, that field is on the fall, so be careful.
I don't have a favorite oyster. I have many favorite oysters, just in a particular time and place, and it's often, you know, it's like my favorite oyster is the place I'm at, tasting it in that place, because there's a synergy to that experience that's really nice. In terms of like if you were going to say literally what's the most flavorful oyster, I would say it's probably the Olympia oyster, which is the native oyster of the Pacific Northwest. It's a super tiny oyster, so it's a bit of a trick answer because it's only about the size of a quarter, maybe a 50-cent piece. It has a lot of flavor for its size, but its size is really small. So people always look at it and think like, oh, you know, that's too tiny, I'm not interested. But if they taste it, it actually packs quite a punch for a little oyster, and it's very different flavor than the oysters we're used to eating on the East Coast. Sort of much more like mushroomy and metallic, and almost kind of like tomato and celery salt.
It's just so you know, another suggested, feel free to give us some of your favorite wines. So as we go along. I thought that was fun. And then another student asked if you were familiar, and of course I know you are, with Duxbury Oysters. And it's a company based here in New England. It was started by a woman who wanted to change her career path. And the question was, how difficult is it to start an oyster farm? Which Seth and you also speak to, of course. And as
Sorry.
we go along, if you want to talk more about kind of the wine and the oyster relationship in your brain, there's been a few questions about that. So if it makes sense, um, we can continue that theme, but also I have like 5 more pages of questions from students.
Sorry, you cut out there a little bit. You're asking about a particular farm?
Someone said there's a company called Ducks Oysters, a company based in New England that was started by a woman who wanted to change her career path. I'm not sure if Tim's on the call, maybe you can tell us what he's referring to. Tim, are you on the call? You must be, since you put this question in the chat. Yes, he is. Tim, unmute yourself and ask the question. Seth, you're muted.
Hey, can you hear me?
So Tim is great. Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, no, my question just was, well, I guess Duxbury is my favorite, so I'm a little bit prone to this company. However, I'm wondering, like, what does it take to like start your own oyster like bay? Like, what needs to happen? I think that's kind of interesting. Like, that's my question. Like, how do you do it?
That sounds like a good question for Seth, if he's there.
So, am I on now?
Yeah.
Am I echoing?
Yes.
I am too.
All right. So your question is, how do you start your own oyster farm and product?
Yes, sir.
It basically, well, anybody can just start a farm. The big question would be, how do you create your own unique oyster in regards to taste or reputation? And that's one of the issues that I see the smaller farmers having in regards to growing oysters, but then how do you market a new name when there are 40 or 50 names on the wholesale markets right now?
Okay, hang on 2 seconds. So typically there's an echo when someone's got their phone and their computer really close to each other. So if anyone has their cell phone near them, or they're on a cell phone and a computer, please like move them far apart or hang out from one, and that should solve the problem. And if not, I'll keep at it, but please, if you guys could try and do that, or at least mute yourselves, and that should help. All right. Rowan, feel free to.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Seth was just saying. Like, one of the big questions is how to differentiate yourself, how to basically come up with a brand. But of course, the other thing I'd add to it now is that everything we might have said 3 weeks ago might no longer apply. We're about to see a huge shakeout in the industry, I think, because oysters are heavily dependent on restaurants. Like, you know, how often do you shuck oysters at home that you got directly from an oyster farm versus going to a restaurant and getting them, or an oyster bar, and all those restaurants are shut down right now. So the oyster industry is really hurting right now, and we'll see what comes out of this on the other end. But I think there'll be a bit of a consolidation, or a lot of consolidation.
Right, we're actually, the class doesn't know this. I'm still getting an echo, but and it's not me. But in 3 weeks we're gonna have a lecture on scalability, which I think should talk about the effects of what we're going through right now in this country, and how certain countries are dealing with it, and how other companies aren't. So I'm gonna ask another question. It says, that are there any companies that explicitly use oysters for bioremediation and not for food production? And can the ability of oysters to sequester heavy metals and other contaminants be scalable and economically relevant level?
I think Seth probably has some good thoughts on this one too. Mine would be that rather than a company, the place I know of that's most interesting that's doing that is the Billion Oyster Project in New York, and they have raised money to restore, I forget, 20 or 30 million oysters to New York Harbor, specifically for the purposes of bioremediate, of improving the water quality. And their goal, of course, is eventually to get to 1 billion oysters. And they're moving pretty fast, but obviously 1 billion takes a long time. In terms of actual bioremediation, I think mussels are even better than oysters because you can hang them on ropes. They're more sort of like deployable, and they filter an insane amount of water and can absorb a lot of toxins. So I think they're probably the best bet for bioremediation. But Seth might have other ideas.
I know 3 items. One is Billion Oyster Project is doing a great job on top of all of the education they're doing with high school kids. So that's important.
Yeah.
The next is 2 land management groups recently in the last 5 years gotten into this. The Trustees of Reservation and Audubon Society are jumping aboard with some of the environmental groups to use oysters to remediate bodies of water in and around Buzzards Bay and in New England. There are management issues from the Division of Marine Fisheries about this, which helps complicate the simple idea of doing that. And then finally, the other species is the kelp that is also a good bioremediator, especially with nitrogen loading. So between the mussels, oysters, and kelp, there are scientists, programs out there that are looking to use these to help clean up certain bodies of water. I know Bridgeport Harbor, they've been doing experiments down there with nitrogen reducing ideas.
Rowan, is there any possibility that you're near a computer?
Sorry, say that again.
Are you near a computer?
Not easily.
And Seth, do you have a phone, like a landline near you?
I do not. Don Benson is not muted. I didn't know if that might be causing it.
I don't know. All right. Well, I'm just going to keep going. We'll have to go to the weird feedback. So another question, and this is probably for both Seth and Craig, is that we have very few trade agreements with countries to bring live shellfish in. Has there been any expansions in trade agreements since the publication of this book? What is the update in that status?
Sorry, again, that was cutting out, so if you can repeat once more.
There was asked if there are any updates on trade agreements bringing live shellfish into other countries.
I think that's all out the window for a while, but I know the U.S. and European Union were working on one, but it was controversial, and I don't think it's going to happen now.
The latest from the East Coast Shellfish Growers Association Walk on the Hill was not a walk, but a virtual conference call. And that topic about opening up the EU for shellfish trading is still in limbo, but hopefully 6 months away, even though we said that 12 months ago.
And is it true that some wild oysters are harvested through dredging, which destroys seafloor habitat?
If you mean the wild harvest,
Yes.
what happens is you would be mechanically harvesting oysters that would be on suitable ground that was given to those folks in a grant, so they would be allowed to do that. So technically, it would not be harming the bottom to compete with other species.
Rowan, so someone asked a question about how flavor is affected by whether it's salmon or whether it's brine. I mean, or sorry, or whether it's a bay or whether it's a cove. You want to address
whether it's a cove or what?
a bay or a sound, and of course that's kind of marine biology, right? But feel free to take it on.
Well, just I mean, with the salinity, the more a body of water is open to the ocean, the higher the salinity level is going to be, and so the saltier the oyster is going to be. I think that's the key factor there. And so then, if you've got a body of water that's really enclosed and has access and has a big inflow of fresh water, like if you think about the Maryland end of the Chesapeake, you're going to get a much less salty oyster in that environment.
Steph, do you have
Taking that one step further, some places are famous, such as the Chesapeake Bay. You can get a real salty oyster that people are famous for harvesting near the ocean, versus if you have a James River or Rappahannock, they're perfectly good oysters, but they're famous for the less salty taste they have. So some people use it to their advantage in their marketing.
What is the comparison of the footprint of an oyster farm compared to other aquaculture farms, such as a salmon farm?
No comparison, I would say. And the key thing to think about, well, there's a few things to think about, but the big one is feed. The beauty of shellfish, what makes it the greenest protein on earth probably, is that you don't have to feed it anything. Like even on land, if you're growing plants, you have to feed them. Shellfish, they get all of their nutrients from the water, so they're a net positive in terms of the environment around them. And salmon farms, you're basically pouring all of that feed into the water. Some of it goes into the salmon, some of it goes through the salmon, but all of it ends up in the environment. And with salmon are carnivorous, so that feed is generally forage fish that are harvested in extremely unsustainable ways from the ocean. So even though it's aquaculture, you're not actually taking the pressure off of wild fish when you're farming salmon. So shellfish are really a big step above any other sort of fin fish aquaculture, I'd say.
And another question for both Rowan and Seth is, how is ocean acidification affecting the quality of oysters? And someone said, if anything, and I'm like, well, they're certainly affecting how farmers think about their future and seedlings and upwellers and all those things. So basically, I guess we could do a little bit of a discussion on the issues around climate change and how that's affecting farmers and what they're thinking about it and what they're looking for as potential solutions. And also, Rowan, I think if you mute yourself when I'm talking, the echo will go away.
I would defer to Seth on that one. He's probably got some pretty direct experience on the acidification front.
So right now, the main concern.
Hang on 1 second. Rowan, could you mute yourself? That might help with the echo.
Okay, hang on.
So the main thing with ocean acidification is at the hatchery level. So a lot of the research that's being done on the East Coast, West Coast, is looking at the water the hatcheries use as the spawn, when they mix the eggs and sperm and all of that, ends up, the development stage is the crucial stage. In my particular case, the hatchery that I use, they've already taken all the concerns for the ocean acidification. I don't see any impact on ocean acidification on my 1-year-old 1.5-inch oysters that I plant. So once your critters are basically bigger than, say, 1/2 inch, ocean acidification should not necessarily impact the quality of your oyster. It could impact the food chain, i.e. the species of phytoplankton that's grown, which then does have a direct impact on the oyster taste. But both East and West Coast folks at the hatchery level are concerned about ocean acidification.
You are unmuted.
So I'm just muting on and off Rowan, which is actually solving the echo problem. So I'm going to ask, if you have a comment, I'm going to ask you a question. All right, well, here comes the question. So there's a 3-part question, and I think I'm going to give it all to you up front, and then I can repeat it if you'd like me to. And you mentioned wild harvesting is still being practiced, but mostly in Washington State. In this kind of environment, are the oysters being cared for by anyone in particular? Is the water being tested? Have you ever wild harvested your own oysters? And do you know of any places in the Northeast where this occurs? Yes, we do. But hang on. The second part of that question is, this person is currently a wastewater engineer in the Northeast and interested in providing a sustainable food source. In your experience, Rowan, have you seen oysters or other shellfish used by municipalities or private landowners for this purpose? And do you see this as being a practical application for the future? This is back to the Billion Oyster Project. And then lastly, how do you think the oyster population will be affected by the ongoing pandemic? And I think we all have some theories about that. So I'm going to unmute you, and then you can give your answers.
You are unmuted.
Great. Seth, you might have muted yourself.
In terms of where to harvest, or like in terms of wild harvesting, well, the Gulf Coast is another great place for wild harvesting. Even more so than Pacific Northwest probably, and the Southeast to a certain extent still has lots of areas that are open for wild harvesting. In New England, there are many fewer, but there are a few spots, and then there's municipalities that actually put out oysters for people to find, almost like Easter eggs. So I know Chatham does that, and a couple of places on Cape Cod do it, I think. And then I don't know of any municipalities that are doing it for wastewater treatment. I'm not sure it's quite practical for them.
But I do think there are municipalities on the Cape that are experimenting with using oysters to uptake nitrogen. Seth can probably speak to that.
You are unmuted.
Definitely these Municipalities are working usually with the Division of Marine Fisheries and trustees of reservations or Autobond. The problem is that once, what do you do with the oysters after they're big enough? And can that suddenly become a public health issue because somebody might go in and try to harvest those oysters that are being used to either reduce nitrogen or clean up a bay, and those oysters are technically in a closed area, at least in Massachusetts, according to the Division of Marine Fisheries, so they can't be harvested. So there's some issues that the division is in the process of trying to address to make it better for these towns to do projects like this.
I'm just going to take Rowan off.
You are unmuted.
Do you have any comments from what Seth said?
Well, it takes a lot of oysters to really make an impact. So one of the, it's great that, these efforts are underway, but in order for them to really be successful, we need to really, you need to reestablish some of the reefs that are out there. So it's really a long-term process of building up those reefs to the point that they can start really self-replicating. But the other thing I'd add to that is that there's some potential for some major reef restoration to happen. I think really even more so than nitrogen removal, the place where oysters are starting to look like they can really pay for themselves quickly is in as living shorelines for storm protection. And you're seeing some pretty big investments in them for that on the Gulf Coast and in the Southeast, and partly with money from the hurricane, FEMA money from Hurricane Recovery Acts and from the Recession Recovery Acts of 2009. I think you're going to see some pretty large-scale oyster reef restoration on the Gulf Coast.
I'm just going to comment on that. I've been, in trying to get your lecture ready for 3 weeks, I've been reading a book called Towards an Urban Ecology. It's by a woman by the name of Kate Orff, O-R-F-F, for those of you who are particularly interested in kind of living shoreline, resilient cities. And that she's a landscape architect, and her company is called Scape, S-C-A-P-E. And their work is really fascinating around this idea of resilience of urban areas and living shorelines. So I wanted to just mention that. And then there's some questions coming around in the chat, Rowan, and one of them is, where in the Pacific Northwest is ideal for oyster beds? Is it Tacoma Sound or a bit south in Portland? And that same, oh no, that's all. Okay, I'm going to unmute you.
You are unmuted.
Pacific Northwest has a lot of places that are great for oysters. Most famously is probably southern Puget Sound. Just bays with really, really rich amounts of plankton in them, where oysters grow really fast. Another spot called Wilpa Bay, it produces a lot of oysters. That's on a little farther southwest on the ocean coast of Washington.
So I'm going to go back to the questions. This is kind of an interesting question, and maybe it'll give us some conversation points. As demands for more sustainable sources of food rise, what do you think will be the main challenges for the oyster farming industry as it grows while still remaining sustainable and environmentally sound?
You are unmuted.
I think, well, the big challenge for the oyster industry going forward, I think, is going to be price and economic sustainability. We'd sort of gotten into this situation in the past 10 years. Oysters really had a big moment, but they've become very pricey, an expensive sort of indulgence that you have when you go out to an oyster bar where you're paying $3 or $4 a piece for an oyster. And not that many people can do it or can do it that often, so it kind of limits the amount of oysters being consumed. where if you look at what oysters used to be, especially coming from areas like the Gulf Coast and the Pacific Northwest, where they were produced in bulk in the old days, by the gallon. I just wonder if on the other side of the pandemic, if the days of the $3 to $4 oyster might be numbered a little bit, and we might have to look at oysters sort of like repositioning themselves somehow in the market. We'll see. I don't know.
Owen, I would be interested in your thoughts on this. So I'm a grower. Historically, so I've been in business 39 years. My price ranges wholesale 65 to 75. On my own oyster farm, I'm getting $26 a dozen. But when I sell to a restaurant, I agree with you. Suddenly you see these restaurants, $2 was a thing, $3, and some people are pushing $4. So I also feel from a oyster growing point of view that if these restaurants are taking my oyster at 70 cents and selling them at $4 a piece, that they are artificially creating less of a demand because of their pricing. What are your thoughts on that?
You are unmuted.
I totally agree, and I wonder if we're going to see them being called on that. And they do the same thing with wine. It's interesting if you're drinking wine in Europe, in Spain or Italy or France, it's not marked up the same way it is by restaurants in the United States, and it's something that you don't have to think about so hard about whether you can afford to get another glass. So it becomes just a part of the culture, a more organic part of the culture in a way, and that's what oysters were here, have always been here, is just a sort of easy part of going out, both with wine and oysters and other things, it's just partly the way the economics of restaurants were set up in the U.S. I think were just like profoundly unsustainable. And I don't know why it's so different than it is in Europe, but I think it would be really interesting to figure out how that came to be and if there is another way to do that.
I think a lot's going to change after this episode we're in currently in this country. And I did speak to someone from Taylor Shellfish, which for people who don't know is a very large shellfish company in the West Coast. And I think it was last week, and he did tell me that after about 5 weeks that they sent out their first shipment of gooey ducks to China. So it was the first time they'd sold product in quite a few weeks, but that also he had lost $1 million from a year ago, February to February.
You are unmuted.
So
yeah, I'm surprised it's not more.
Jen and Rowan, quickly back to Kate Orff. Rowan, you know Joff Davis, correct?
Oh, hang on,
You are unmuted.
Yes, I do.
So his daughter Hannah worked for Kate Orff for 2 years because of her experience growing up on an oyster farm and the really cool work that she is doing to develop these natural oyster reefs, including in the New York area, because that's where her office is in Manhattan. But she is doing some great work around the planet, actually, in regards to trying to put some of this natural stuff back in to prevent storm surge and helping out, with oysters filtering water. And you're absolutely right. You've got to make massive oyster reefs to have 2 impacts: one on the water quality, but 2 to create these natural barrier reefs that used to be there before we came, 400 years ago and started altering the shorelines. Just a comment.
You are unmuted.
We can have her join us for the sustainability lecture. That'd be fun. So I have another question kind of in the chat room for both Rowan and Seth. How do you think Lake Okeechobee polluted runoff is affecting the Gulf of Mexico oysters?
You are unmuted.
Well, the Okeechobee runoff is a huge problem. it's definitely affecting the manatees. I don't know. You know, it's kind of not near any real oyster growing areas. It's so far south in Florida. So I don't know if it's directly impacting. And certainly the Gulf has plenty of other similar issues to deal with.
So I'm gonna, on that same theme, and maybe it can be the last question unless folks have some other ones that they want to ask directly or through the chat. So someone asked about the ecological balance of oyster farms. Can you have too many oysters growing in one place that you do offset, I just want to use the word carrying capacity of the ecosystem or the area that the oysters are growing?
You are unmuted.
Well, I'll let Seth give his perspective, but mine is like no. I mean, no, because oysters are they are the ecosystem. Like, you know, they build habitat. They're ecosystem engineers. So, you know, you look at those reefs that used to exist. It's kind of like saying, are there too many trees in the forest? You know, so I think no, you can't. You don't have to worry about that in a place where they would normally be growing naturally.
I would say that's true, except if you're in a limited saltwater pond or an area and you plant too many, you might end up with a shorter growing season, because if you, let's say, double the capacity of your farm, then if the area ever got stressed out due to too high temperatures, either too much rain or too little rain, the oysters might eat all the phytoplankton that might last normally till November. They might run out in October. And we actually saw that on a couple of farms on the Cape in certain areas. They depended on oyster growth through the third week of November, and pretty much they stopped growing by the second week of October. This was about 2 years ago. So in a recent Massachusetts Aquaculture Association meeting, we kind of were just telling war stories, and several of the farmers started to connect the dots on a few things. So it's similar to putting, in my mind, too many cows on an acre of farmland. But if you have the right balance, then you can have a sustainable amount of food for the amount of oysters that you plant. It's totally site specific. If you're an ocean source, it doesn't matter. But if you might be in a smaller, secluded little embayment and suddenly you wanted to double or triple your production, you could ultimately see a limiting factor of either they're consuming too much oxygen or they're eating up all the food too quickly and they're stunting their growth later on in the season.
I do have another question for Rowan. Someone was curious, and maybe Seth too, pertaining to shellfish aquaculture, how much untapped potential space exists in the Atlantic provinces?
You are unmuted.
Huge, especially in the southeast. There's a huge amount of potential space. If you look at all those embayments through North Carolina and especially North Carolina, but also South Carolina, there's a ton of space down there.
Interestingly, there's a ton of space, but if we all grow oysters, then the market becomes saturated. So from aquaculture point of view, we need to be looking at other species to grow that are actually feeding a world population, because oysters tend to be a higher end food product, where some of the other freshwater and saltwater fish really need to be expanded. And then the other interesting thing is that because we don't have any significant offshore farms yet, at least the United States, we don't know the capacity of what industry would be willing to do on our offshore farms.
You are unmuted.
So I gave you the floor, and I'm not sure if you want to post some comments or not.
Yeah, well, I totally agree. If depending on what your goals are, you might want to look at other species. I mean, and if the goal is protein production, then I still think mussels are a biggie.
I agree. I just want to thank you so much for joining us at this crazy time. It's really great for me to be able to assign your book for the semester and then actually have you come and be present with us during a time like this. Makes us all a little more connected to what we're reading and whose work we're looking at and really what we're kind of focused on at this moment in time. So I can't thank you enough. I appreciate it. And I know you're in the middle of nowhere and finding a connection was a challenge today. So I really appreciate it.
You are unmuted.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it was a pleasure to be able to join you all, and thanks for all the excellent questions too.
Can you guys all unmute? Thank you. We'll have a cacophony of echoes and thank yous.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rowan. That was great.
Thank you.
Good to hear your voice,
Hey, thank you so much. Amazing.
Thank you, sir.
Great. Thank you guys.
Thank you, Rowan, very much.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right, take care, everyone.
Take care.
May the force be with you.